They looked like the ultimate power couple of the 1980s. One was a beloved TV star, the other a rock legend. But behind the glossy magazine covers and red carpet appearances was a story full of emotional highs, crushing lows, and one woman's painful journey toward healing. In 1980, America was charmed when 20-year-old Valerie Bertinelli, the bubbly star of One Day at a Time, crossed paths with 25-year-old Eddie Van Halen, the electrifying guitarist whose band was rewriting the rules of rock music. Their chemistry was instant. Valerie had seen Eddie on the cover of Rolling Stone and thought he was adorable. Not long after, they were set up at a concert, and that was it. Within 8 months, they were married. To fans, it was a dream come true. The down-to-earth TV darling and the wild rock and roll prodigy had found love in a chaotic industry. Their wedding, held in April 1981, became a tabloid staple. But while the public was swooning over their storybook romance, the couple was already navigating cracks beneath the surface. In the early years of their marriage, Valerie and Eddie were living at the epicenter of two massive cultural forces: network television and hard rock. On the surface, it was thrilling. Valerie was winning awards, Eddie was selling out stadiums, and their lives were anything but ordinary. But fame comes with a cost, and for Eddie, the currency was control. Backstage at Van Halen concerts wasn't just electric, it was chaos. The band was riding high on album sales and infamy, and their dressing rooms often looked more like backstage carnivals than workspaces. Drugs were everywhere. Alcohol flowed constantly. And Eddie, though soft-spoken off stage, was quietly drowning in the pressure to keep performing, musically and socially. He didn't just drink to celebrate, he drank to silence, to numb, to disappear. Valerie, meanwhile, was trying to be the grounding force. She flew across the country to be with him, showing up at hotels and tour buses, hoping her presence might somehow anchor him. But she didn't understand addiction. Not really. She thought love could fix it. That if she just supported him enough, reminded him of who he was at his core, he'd come back to her. But the man she loved was slipping further away each night. As she later revealed, she often found herself sitting alone in hotel rooms, not knowing where Eddie was or when he'd return. When he did come back, he was often distant, high, or angry, not violent, but detached. Like his soul had left the room hours before his body did. She tried to convince herself it was just a phase, that it was the price of genius. There were brief windows of normalcy, dinners at home, days when Eddie stayed sober, sweet moments when he played piano in their living room and looked at her like nothing else in the world existed. But those days were becoming rarer, and Valerie knew it. She could feel the gap growing wider. The Eddie she had married, the shy, brilliant boy with the crooked smile, was being replaced by someone she didn't recognize. And yet, she stayed. Not because she was blind, but because she was hopeful. Because she believed in second chances. Because that's what you do when you love someone who's hurting. You try to be their lifeline, even if it's dragging you under too. But every party ends eventually, and when it did, it wasn't with fireworks. It ended quietly, in silence, in tears behind closed doors. Valerie wasn't just fighting to keep her marriage afloat. She was trying to rescue someone who didn't want to be saved, at least not in the way she imagined. In her words, she was drowning while trying to hold someone else above water. It was a silent, private unraveling. No explosive fights in public, no tabloid meltdowns, just a slow-motion erosion that took place behind the walls of their home. Often disguised by smiles on red carpets and quick interviews that always ended with, "We're doing great." Behind the scenes, Eddie's addiction wasn't just a dark cloud, it was the atmosphere. Valerie recounted nights spent pacing the house, calling hospitals, or lying in bed awake, listening for the sound of the front door. Some nights he came home, some nights he didn't. When he did, it wasn't always the Eddie she fell in love with. Substance use blurred his brilliance and pulled him further into isolation. She tried everything: rehab stints, couples therapy, setting boundaries, then erasing them out of guilt. And each failed attempt chipped away at her own sense of self. Valerie described moments where she didn't even recognize herself in the mirror, like she was performing the role of a supportive wife rather than living it. But still, she stayed. Out of love, out of hope, and out of a belief that if she just tried a little harder, maybe things would change. But addiction doesn't respond to love. It devours it. And Valerie began to realize she was not only losing her husband, she was losing herself. Her mental health declined quietly. She developed a disordered relationship with food, using it to cope with emotions she couldn't speak aloud. She went from starlet to caregiver, from wife to emotional first responder, and at some point, the romance stopped feeling like love and started feeling like survival. Even when their son Wolfgang was born, it was not the magical turning point she hoped for. Eddie adored his son, yes, but fatherhood didn't erase the disease. The late nights continued, the broken promises piled up, and Valerie found herself trying to protect her child from the same emotional landmines she had been stepping on for years. In interviews years later, she wouldn't villainize Eddie. She spoke of his heart, his genius, his playfulness, but she also spoke the truth. Loving someone deeply does not mean you can save them from themselves. And the longer you try, the more you risk losing your own life in the process. By the turn of the millennium, Valerie and Eddie had become experts at smiling for the cameras while silently drifting further apart. On the surface, they were still a family, attending events, supporting their son Wolfgang, occasionally showing up in public together. But behind closed doors, they were no longer a couple in any real sense of the word. The tension had become the wallpaper of their everyday lives. Valerie would later describe a growing numbness, the kind that settles in when hope begins to fade, but you're too exhausted or too afraid to let go completely. Every moment of calm was temporary. Every attempt to fix things eventually unraveled. Eddie was still in the throes of addiction, and Valerie, though deeply loyal, had run out of emotional fuel. In 2001, after 20 years together, they quietly separated. No public announcement, no paparazzi swarms, just a private decision between two people who once believed they'd grow old together. The silence surrounding their split was intentional, protective even. Valerie wasn't ready to let the media dissect their pain, and Eddie, ever private despite his fame, had no interest in making a spectacle of their unraveling. And yet, that quiet departure said everything. For Valerie, it was a moment of devastating clarity. Love alone couldn't carry the weight of unhealed wounds. She wasn't walking away from Eddie in anger. She was stepping away from a version of herself she no longer recognized. Someone who had spent decades absorbing the chaos, putting everyone else's needs before her own. They remained legally married for several more years, finalizing their divorce in 2007. But their romantic bond had already been severed long before the paperwork made it official. Even so, they stayed in each other's lives. For their son, yes, but also because some connections don't end. They just change form. For decades, Valerie Bertinelli kept most of the painful parts of her marriage locked away, safe behind public smiles and carefully curated interviews. But silence, even when well-intentioned, doesn't equal peace. It wasn't until years after her divorce that she finally allowed herself to revisit those emotional wounds, not to relive them, but to understand them. And in doing so, she discovered something powerful. Telling the truth doesn't just free others, it frees you. Her memoir, Enough Already, wasn't a tell-all in the scandalous tabloid sense. It was quieter than that, more human. She didn't aim to villainize Eddie, nor paint herself as a martyr. Instead, she pulled back the curtain on the emotional cost of loving someone who is in pain, and how that pain seeps into your own soul, whether you notice it or not. She spoke candidly about the cycles of guilt and self-blame that consumed her. How she tried to be the perfect wife, then the perfect mother, and finally just invisible. Because sometimes when you love an addict, you stop asking for what you need. You think maybe if you stay silent long enough, or give enough of yourself away, they'll finally be okay. But that's not how healing works. Not for them. And certainly not for you. Valerie wrote of her inner battles with body image and worthiness, often shaped by an industry obsessed with appearance and a marriage clouded by instability. She recounted turning to food as a comfort, and then punishing herself for doing so. Her vulnerability was startling, not because it was shocking, but because it was so familiar. So many people, especially women, saw themselves in her pages. And for the first time, Valerie stopped apologizing. She stopped minimizing her experience or sugarcoating it to protect anyone else's legacy. Not out of resentment, but out of self-respect. She learned that owning your pain isn't about staying stuck in it. It's about reclaiming the narrative before it swallows you whole. And that choice, to stand in her truth, even if it trembled, marked the beginning of a very different chapter in Valerie's life. In 2020, Eddie Van Halen passed away after a long battle with cancer. Valerie was by his side when he died, along with their son Wolfgang. It was a moment she later described as soul-shattering. Despite everything, the addiction, the divorce, the years of pain, Valerie still called him her soulmate. She posted a heartfelt tribute, sharing photos of their early days, that enclosed with the haunting words, "See you in our next life, my love." The grief hit hard, but this time, she didn't run from it. She faced it head-on. Instead of disappearing from the public eye, Valerie began using her platform to speak up about mental health, body image, toxic relationships, and the journey to self-love. She started making videos from her kitchen, where she laughed, cried, and cooked for her viewers with raw honesty. Her vulnerability struck a chord. Suddenly, she wasn't just a former sitcom star or Eddie's ex. She was every woman who's ever felt broken but kept going. Every person who's ever loved deeply and lost painfully. She told her audience, "You don't move on, you move forward." And she has. Today, Valerie Bertinelli is more than a celebrity. She's a source of light for people going through dark times. Her story isn't a cautionary tale about marrying a rock star. It's a story about growth, resilience, and learning to stop abandoning yourself for someone else. Eddie Van Halen will always be a part of her story, but he's not the end of it. Their relationship taught her about loyalty, heartbreak, forgiveness, and the painful beauty of letting go with love. And now, she's turning that experience into wisdom she shares with the world. Because at the end of the day, Valerie's greatest love story might just be the one she's writing with herself. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button, subscribe for more real-life journeys and behind-the-scenes untold stories, and check out the links in the description for more videos and updates. You never know who might need to hear a story like this today. Thanks for watching, and remember, you are not alone.